For centuries, the zodiac has been viewed as a mystical system of signs, personalities, and destinies written in the heavens. But what if its original purpose was something far more practical? What if the zodiac was never primarily about predicting the future, but about understanding how human beings adapt to the conditions of their time? Viewed through the lens of modern psychology, the zodiac can be interpreted as an early symbolic language describing the relationship between environment, adaptation, personality, and human relationships. Beneath its animals, elements, and cycles lies a surprisingly modern insight. The conditions we experience shape the behaviors we develop, and those behaviors leave lasting traces across individuals, relationships, and generations. This presentation explores the zodiac not as a supernatural mechanism of fate, but as an ancient civilizational attempt to understand human adaptation long before modern behavioral science emerged. Modern society already accepts a framework built on the same principle: generational cohorts. Baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z emerged because people noticed that those raised under similar historical conditions often develop shared adaptive tendencies. Boomers were shaped by post-war stability and institutional trust. Generation X adapted to uncertainty and self-reliance. Millennials matured during globalization and digital expansion. Generation Z developed amid constant connectivity and heightened uncertainty. Importantly, these categories describe broad patterns, not fixed personalities. Individuals remain unique. The key insight is simple. Shared developmental environments can produce recurring adaptive patterns across cohorts. Modern sociology describes these patterns through generations. Ancient systems described them through animals, elements, and cycles. Different languages. Similar observation. People adapt to the conditions in which they develop. Stable periods tend to reward persistence, structure, and loyalty. Economic uncertainty rewards independence and resourcefulness. Technological change rewards adaptability and rapid learning. Fragmentation and instability often reward vigilance and sensitivity to uncertainty. Over time, repeatedly rewarded behaviors become stable adaptive patterns. This does not mean birth timing determines destiny. It means developmental timing influences the conditions through which adaptation first occurs. That is why people raised in different eras often display recognizable cohort tendencies while remaining unique individuals. From this perspective, the zodiac can be understood as an early attempt to capture the same insight. Different conditions produce different adaptations. The symbols differ, but the observation remains familiar to modern psychology. Environment shapes adaptation, and adaptation shapes behavior. Modern behavioral science uses statistics. Ancient systems used symbols. Today we speak of cohorts, developmental psychology, environmental conditioning, and behavioral adaptation. Ancient cultures spoke of animals, elements, cycles, and archetypes. The language differs, but the underlying observation may be the same. Timing influences adaptation. People raised under different conditions often develop different coping styles, behavioral tendencies, and relationship patterns. Modern science describes these patterns through data. Ancient systems described them through symbols. One uses statistics. The other uses stories. Both seek to understand how environment and experience shape human behavior over time. The zodiac animals can be viewed not as fixed personalities, but as symbolic representations of recurring adaptive strategies. The rat represents resourcefulness in uncertain environments. The ox represents persistence when long-term effort is required. The tiger represents bold action when challenges demand courage. The rabbit represents caution when survival depends on careful risk management. Each strategy becomes useful under different conditions. None is universally superior. Modern psychology recognizes similar patterns as adaptive behaviors shaped through experience and reinforcement. In this sense, the animals function as compressed behavioral archetypes, simple symbols preserving observations about how different environments encourage different ways of adapting. The central insight is simple. Different environments reinforce different strategies, and repeated strategies become stable behavioral patterns. Interactionist psychology suggests that present conditions do not create personality. They activate existing adaptations. A child raised amid uncertainty may develop vigilance and caution. A child raised with stability and opportunity may develop confidence and exploration. These adaptations become reinforced over time and form stable behavioral templates. Different environments then activate different parts of the same person. When present conditions reward caution, vigilance becomes a strength. When conditions reward innovation and growth, openness and exploration become advantages. The present is not acting on a blank slate. It interacts with patterns shaped by earlier developmental experiences. From this perspective, the influence of a year can be understood as the interaction between current conditions and past adaptation. Or more simply, the present activates the past. People do not express every part of themselves equally in every situation. The same person can appear very different under different conditions. In high-threat environments, vigilance, caution, and risk detection become valuable and are reinforced. In opportunity-rich environments, exploration, creativity, and innovation become more visible because those behaviors are rewarded. In unstable environments, the same adaptive strengths can become overactivated. Caution may become hesitation, and risk awareness may become risk avoidance. The person has not changed. The environment has. Different conditions activate different parts of the same adaptive system. Modern psychology calls this selective activation. Certain strengths, vulnerabilities, and coping strategies become more prominent when circumstances reward or demand them. Under this interpretation, what traditional zodiac systems describe as the influence of a year can be understood as the interaction between present conditions and previously formed adaptations. Resonant conditions amplify strengths. Misaligned conditions suppress them. The key question is not simply who you are, but which parts of you the current environment brings to life. Traditional zodiac systems describe harmonious periods and clashes. Psychologically, these can be understood as environmental fit and environmental mismatch. Consider the same cautious person shown on both sides of this slide. On the left, caution is rewarded in a risk management environment. Vigilance prevents mistakes, confidence grows, and performance improves. Existing strengths are reinforced. This is harmony, an environment that supports established adaptive strategies. On the right, the same cautious person works in high-pressure sales. Rapid action and constant persuasion are rewarded. Vigilance may become hesitation, and strengths can become limitations. This is clash, an environment that conflicts with previously successful adaptations. The person has not changed. The environment has. When conditions match our adaptive patterns, they are strengthened. When conditions oppose them, they can become destabilized. Under this interpretation, harmonious years and zodiac clashes are not mysterious forces. They are symbolic descriptions of the fit or mismatch between present conditions and the behavioral strategies we developed earlier in life. Compatibility is not simply about matching traits. It is about how two adaptive systems interact under shared conditions. Each person brings attachment patterns, emotional habits, stress responses, and developmental experiences into a relationship. When partners help regulate each other's emotions and create psychological safety, compatibility emerges. Differences can become strengths. One person's structure may balance another's flexibility. One person's calmness may steady another's anxiety. Attachment styles shape trust and closeness. Emotional regulation shapes how people recover from stress. Communication determines whether differences become bridges or barriers. Conflict often arises when partners repeatedly trigger each other's defensive patterns. The issue is usually not personality itself, but the interaction between adaptive systems. When a good fit exists, resilience grows, stress decreases, and differences become complementary. When a poor fit persists, defensive cycles intensify and the relationship becomes destabilizing. Under this interpretation, zodiac compatibility becomes symbolic shorthand for what modern psychology calls co-regulation, the ability of two people to stabilize, support, and strengthen one another. Compatibility is not about finding the same person. It is about creating the conditions where two different people can regulate, support, and grow together. At first glance, the zodiac and modern psychology seem to belong to completely different worlds. One speaks through animals, elements, cycles, and archetypes. The other speaks through adaptation, development, behavior, and emotional regulation. Yet both may be trying to understand the same phenomenon: how human beings are shaped by the conditions in which they live. Ancient societies encoded their observations symbolically. Modern psychology studies them scientifically. What the zodiac described as animals, psychology might describe as adaptive strategies. What ancient systems called harmony and clash, psychology might call environmental fit and mismatch. What appeared as annual influences can be understood as different conditions activating different aspects of the same person. At the center of both perspectives lies the idea of human adaptation. People develop within environments. Environments shape behavior. Repeated behaviors become stable patterns that influence relationships, coping styles, and identity. The symbols are different. The language is different. But the underlying question remains remarkably similar. How do time, environment, and experience shape the way human beings adapt, relate, and behave over the course of a lifetime? Under this interpretation, the zodiac becomes less a system of fate and more an early attempt to understand human adaptation long before modern behavioral science existed. This model is probabilistic, not deterministic. Birth timing may influence early developmental conditions, but it does not determine destiny. Two people born in the same year can become very different individuals because personality is shaped by many influences: family, biology, culture, education, relationships, life experiences, trauma, and socio-economic conditions. These factors interact throughout life, producing unique developmental paths. For this reason, the zodiac should not be viewed as a tool of prediction. Its value lies in preserving observations about developmental timing, adaptation, environmental influences, and recurring behavioral patterns across generations. In modern terms, it is better understood as a framework for recognizing tendencies rather than forecasting outcomes. A map, not a mandate. A description of possibilities, not a declaration of fate. Under this interpretation, the zodiac becomes a symbolic record of accumulated observations about how human beings adapt to the conditions in which they live. Viewed through a modern lens, the zodiac appears less as a system of fate and more as an early attempt to understand how recurring conditions shape human behavior. Ancient observers recognized patterns. They noticed that timing mattered, that environments influenced behavior, and that certain tendencies seemed to repeat across generations. Without modern psychology, they encoded those observations into symbols, animals, elements, and cycles. The core insight was simple. Environment shapes adaptation. Adaptation shapes behavior. Repeated behavior leaves lasting psychological traces. Modern psychology studies this process through conditioning, reinforcement, and development. The language has changed. The observation remains. The zodiac's enduring value may therefore lie not in prediction, but in the intuitions it preserved. That timing matters. That environments shape adaptation. That repeated reinforcement builds enduring patterns. And that relationships flourish when adaptive systems support and regulate one another. In this sense, the zodiac can be viewed as a symbolic predecessor to modern generational psychology, an ancient language describing the relationship between time, environment, adaptation, personality, and human relationships. The symbols are ancient. The question remains timeless. How do the conditions we experience shape the people we become? If ancient systems were not scientifically precise, why did they survive for thousands of years? One reason is that they preserved useful observations in forms people could easily remember and transmit. Ancient observers noticed recurring patterns in behavior, environment, and life circumstances. Rather than storing these as theories, they compressed them into symbols, animals, elements, stories, and archetypes. A single symbol could represent a large cluster of behavioral insights. Stories and images are also easier to remember than abstract explanations. The zodiac therefore functioned as a cultural memory system long before modern psychology existed. Because these symbols were memorable, they could be passed from parents to children, teachers to students, and communities across generations. Importantly, observations can survive even when the underlying mechanism is unknown. Ancient people may not have understood developmental conditioning or reinforcement learning, but they could still recognize recurring behavioral patterns. Viewed this way, the zodiac may have endured not because it explained everything correctly, but because it preserved useful observations about human behavior in a form people could remember, teach, and share. Modern psychology explains the patterns. Ancient symbolic systems helped preserve them. Everything begins with the environment. Family, culture, opportunities, hardships, and historical conditions create pressures that reward certain behaviors. People respond by developing adaptive behaviors. Some become cautious, persistent, independent, cooperative, or bold. Initially, these are practical responses to circumstances. When those behaviors repeatedly lead to success, safety, or acceptance, they become reinforced. The environment teaches, "This works, do it again." Over time, reinforced behaviors become stable tendencies. What began as adaptation becomes temperament. Eventually, temperament becomes identity. A person no longer says, "I act cautiously." They say, "I am a cautious person." This sequence provides a bridge between ancient observation and modern psychology. Ancient systems described these patterns through animals, elements, and cycles. Modern behavioral science explains them through adaptation, reinforcement, personality development, and identity formation. The core insight is the same. Environment shapes behavior. Repeated behavior shapes temperament. Temperament shapes identity.